The year is 1943, and the war has swallowed continents. Cities burn under bombing raids, oceans are filled with submarines, and entire nations mobilize every available hand for survival. For the first time in modern history, thousands of women are not only supporting the war from factories and hospitals, they are wearing uniforms. They are sworn in to service. They carry classified documents. They fly military aircraft. Some even carry weapons behind enemy lines. In the United States, more than 150,000 women serve in the Women's Army Corps, known as the WAC. They work as mechanics, radio operators, intelligence clerks, drivers, and cryptographers. They free up men for the front lines, but many of them serve dangerously close to combat zones. Across the Atlantic, British women in the Air Transport Auxiliary fly over 300,000 aircraft deliveries during the war, transporting Spitfires, Hurricanes, and bombers from factories to operational squadrons. These pilots often fly without radios, without weapons, and sometimes without proper navigation instruments. Yet they fly through blackout skies, mechanical failures, and unpredictable weather. In occupied France, women take on even more dangerous roles. They become couriers for the resistance, hiding coded messages in bicycle frames and bread baskets. They sabotage railway lines, cut telephone wires, and guide Allied pilots to escape routes through Spain. In the Soviet Union, women serve as snipers, tank drivers, and fighter pilots. The famous night bomber regiments, later nicknamed the Night Witches by German troops, conduct thousands of harassment missions against enemy positions. For these women, the battlefield is not symbolic, it is real. At first glance, international law appears clear. The Geneva Convention of 1929 outlines protections for prisoners of war. Captured soldiers are to be treated humanely, given food, shelter, and medical care. Many women entering military service believe these protections apply to them equally. They wear insignia, they carry identification, they follow military command structures. They assume that if captured, they will be treated as lawful combatants. But Nazi ideology does not view them that way. Adolf Hitler's regime promotes a rigid vision of gender roles. In official propaganda, German women are expected to focus on children, family, and loyalty to the state. The idea of women fighting in uniform for enemy nations is portrayed as unnatural, even degenerate. In Nazi racial doctrine, women who resist German occupation are not legitimate soldiers, they are criminals, terrorists, or political threats. This ideological lens changes everything. When male soldiers are captured on conventional battlefields, they are usually processed through established military systems. But when female resistance members are arrested in Paris or Warsaw, they are often handed directly to the Gestapo. Instead of prisoners of war camps, many are sent to interrogation centers. Their status is questioned. Their uniforms do not guarantee recognition. Some are accused of espionage simply because they operated behind enemy lines. The danger begins the moment of capture. Survivor testimonies describe sudden arrests during routine missions, a courier stopped at a checkpoint, a radio operator betrayed by a neighbor, a safe house raided at dawn. Within minutes, identities are stripped away, documents are confiscated, blindfolds are tied tightly. Interrogations begin quickly and aggressively, aimed not only at extracting information, but at dismantling networks. Under Nazi policy, resistance fighters are frequently denied prisoners of war protections. The regime labels them as partisans, a category that allows for summary execution under certain decrees. The infamous Commando Order of 1942 authorizes the execution of captured Allied commandos, regardless of uniform. Although primarily directed at special operations forces, its spirit influences how non-conventional fighters, including women, are treated. In this environment, gender offers no safety. In fact, it often increases vulnerability. Captured women face a system that does not know where to place them. They are too political to be ordinary prisoners, too unconventional to be recognized soldiers. Many are transferred to prisons and eventually to concentration camps designed specifically for women. One such camp, Ravensbrück, located north of Berlin, becomes the largest concentration camp for women in the German Reich. Over 130,000 women passed through its gates during the war. Among them are resistance members, political prisoners, and captured fighters from across Europe. Conditions are brutal. Overcrowding, forced labor, malnutrition, and disease are widespread. Some prisoners are subject to medical experiments without consent. Others are forced into labor producing goods for the German war effort. The system is designed to break bodies and spirits. Yet, even in these conditions, stories of defiance emerge. Women form quiet support networks. They share scraps of bread. They pass coded messages in whispers. They memorize the names of the dead to preserve their identities in case they themselves do not survive. Some sabotage production lines subtly, damaging equipment in ways that are difficult to detect. Others maintain morale through song, prayer, or silent gestures of solidarity. Not all are liberated. Many do not survive long enough to see Allied forces advance into Germany in 1945. But those who do carry stories that reshape historical understanding. During the post-war trials, including proceedings in Nuremberg, evidence of mistreatment and systemic abuse inside camps is presented to the world. Testimonies from survivors reveal not only physical suffering, but the calculated denial of legal protections. The war ends in 1945, but recognition comes slowly. For decades, the narrative of World War II centers primarily on male combat experience. The stories of captured female soldiers and resistance fighters remain scattered in memoirs, archives, and court documents. Only later does scholarship begin to fully document the scale of their involvement and the risks they faced. What makes their story so striking is not only the cruelty of the system they encountered, but the assumptions that preceded it. They believed they were protected by uniform, by law, by the rules of war. In many cases, those rules failed them. Ideology overrode convention. Prejudice overrode legality. And yet their participation permanently altered military history. They proved that modern war would never again be defined exclusively by men. They demonstrated competence under fire, endurance under captivity, and resilience under systematic oppression. In 1943, when the world seemed consumed entirely by destruction, these women stepped forward into the roles no previous generation had occupied on such a scale. They flew aircraft through hostile skies. They carried secrets across occupied cities. They fought in forests and on frozen battlefields. And when captured, many endured conditions that tested the limits of human survival. By 1943, much of Europe lives under occupation. German flags hang over government buildings in Paris, Warsaw, Prague, and countless smaller towns. Curfews are enforced. Radios are confiscated. Posters warn that aiding the enemy will be punished by death. Yet, in the shadows of this controlled world, resistance networks continue to operate, and many of their most important members are women. They're chosen precisely because they attract less suspicion at first glance. A young woman riding a bicycle with a loaf of bread appears ordinary. A nurse carrying medical supplies draws little attention. A secretary typing reports in an office may overhear conversations that change the course of operations. But this invisibility is fragile. One informant, one intercepted message, one routine search at a checkpoint can bring everything crashing down. Arrests often happen suddenly. A door is kicked open before dawn. Boots strike wooden floors. Papers are thrown into the air. Family members are pushed aside as names are shouted. In occupied France, thousands are detained on suspicion of supporting the resistance. Among them are women who served as radio operators for Allied intelligence services, including Britain's Special Operations Executive. These women were trained to transmit coded messages back to London, coordinating sabotage and supply drops. The work was dangerous. German counterintelligence units carried vans equipped with radio detection technology, triangulating signals block by block. When a signal was traced, arrest could follow within hours. Once detained, many women are not treated as conventional soldiers. Instead of being processed through military channels, they are handed to the Gestapo, the secret state police. Interrogation centers, such as those in Paris's Avenue Foch or Berlin's Prince Albrechtstrasse, become places of relentless questioning. Captors seek names, locations, frequencies, passwords. They seek the collapse of entire networks. The legal distinction becomes critical. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, lawful combatants captured in uniform are entitled to prisoner of war status. But Nazi authorities frequently argue that resistance members are francs-tireurs, irregular fighters who do not qualify for protections. Women captured in civilian clothes, even if acting under military command, are particularly vulnerable to this classification. In German records, many are labeled as spies, and spies, under wartime law, can be executed. This classification is not merely bureaucratic, it determines survival. A male British soldier captured on a battlefield in North Africa is likely transported to a POW camp such as Stalag Luft. A female courier captured in Lyon may face weeks of interrogation without any formal recognition of status. Some are beaten, others are psychologically pressured, threatened with harm to family members, isolated in cells without light, deprived of sleep. The goal is not only information, but intimidation. In Eastern Europe, the situation can be even harsher. As German forces push deep into Soviet territory, partisan warfare intensifies. Soviet women serve as snipers, scouts, and medics within partisan units operating behind German lines. When captured during anti-partisan sweeps, they are often accused of banditry or terrorism. German anti-partisan policies are brutal, frequently involving summary executions. Entire villages suspected of aiding resistance fighters are destroyed. The ideological element cannot be ignored. Nazi racial doctrine dehumanizes entire populations, particularly in the East. Soviet women captured in uniform are not viewed through the same lens as Western Allied personnel. They are often categorized within a broader system that combines political repression and racial persecution. Survival rates in these circumstances are drastically lower. Even Western Allied women face uncertainty. British and American women serving in official military organizations are rarely in direct frontline combat, but some operate in forward areas. If captured, their treatment depends heavily on circumstance, where they were captured, who captured them, and how they are classified. Documentation shows cases where women were interrogated intensely to determine whether they were legitimate military personnel or intelligence agents. For many captives, the first days are the most terrifying. There is no clear information about what will happen next. Some are transferred from local prisons to larger detention centers. Others disappear into transport systems that move prisoners across borders in overcrowded rail cars. Destination is often unknown. Rumors spread among prisoners: labor camp, concentration camp, execution site. Transportation itself becomes an ordeal. Survivors later describe cattle cars packed beyond capacity, little ventilation, minimal water, and no sanitation. Journeys last days. Guards shout orders in German. Names are replaced with numbers at arrival. At camps like Ravensbrück, established in 1939 specifically for women, newly arrived prisoners are processed, shaved, and assigned identification numbers. Nationalities mix: French, Polish, Soviet, Dutch, German political dissidents. Some are seasoned resistance members,
Others were arrested for small acts of defiance, distributing leaflets, hiding a radio, sheltering a pilot. What unites them is the sudden stripping of legal clarity. The uniform that once symbolized service offers no shield here. Instead, they enter a system built on ideological hierarchy, where status is determined not by international convention, but by Nazi categorization. Yet, despite this, many women refuse to surrender their sense of identity. In interrogation rooms, some deliberately provide false information to buy time for their networks. Radio operators sometimes transmit misleading signals before capture to protect contacts. Resistance leaders instruct members to memorize as little as possible, reducing the damage under questioning. Courage takes many forms. For some, it is silence. For others, it is the decision to endure without betraying comrades. Post-war investigations reveal numerous cases where captured women withheld critical details even under extreme pressure, allowing resistance cells to survive longer than German authorities anticipated. By late 1944, as Allied forces advance into Western Europe and Soviet armies push from the east, the fate of prisoners becomes even more precarious. Camps are evacuated, forced marches begin. Prisoners are driven across freezing landscapes to prevent liberation by approaching armies. These evacuations, later known as death marches, claim thousands of lives. When the war finally ends in 1945, liberation reveals the scale of the system. Documents recovered from German offices show deliberate policies denying POW protections to certain categories of fighters. Testimonies from survivors describe the gap between expectation and reality, between the rules they believed governed warfare and the ideology that overrode those rules. Chapter by chapter, arrest by arrest, the pattern becomes clear. Capture was not merely the loss of freedom, it was entry into a legal gray zone where classification determined survival, and where women who believed they were soldiers discovered that their captors did not always agree. Their stories expose a central tension of modern war, the difference between written law and enforced policy. On paper, protections existed. On practice, ideology reshaped application. And for many captured women in 1943 and beyond, that difference meant the boundary between life and death.
When the transport doors opened, the first thing many women saw was barbed wire stretching toward the horizon. Guard towers stood at intervals, rifles pointed downward. Dogs barked. Orders were shouted in German. This was not a prisoner of war camp governed by military protocol. This was a concentration camp system designed to isolate, exploit, and often destroy. One of the central sites for female prisoners was Ravensbrück, located about 90 kilometers north of Berlin. Established in 1939, it became the largest concentration camp for women in the German Reich. By the end of the war, more than 130,000 women had been imprisoned there. They came from over 20 nations: French resistance couriers, Polish political prisoners, Soviet partisans, German dissidents, Dutch students, and others. Some were captured in uniform. Others were arrested for acts as small as distributing leaflets. The intake process was deliberately dehumanizing. Prisoners were ordered to undress. Hair was shaved, personal belongings were confiscated, names were replaced with numbers sewn onto striped uniforms. The transformation was immediate and psychological. Identity was stripped away within hours. Daily life inside the camp revolved around forced labor. Many women were assigned to work details, producing textiles, assembling electrical components, or constructing materials for the German war industry. As the war intensified, labor demands increased. Satellite subcamps linked to industrial firms expanded, connecting concentration camp labor directly to military production. Exhaustion was constant. Shifts could last 10 to 12 hours or more, often with inadequate food.
Malnutrition quickly weakened immune systems. Rations typically consisted of thin soup, small portions of bread, and occasional substitutes with little nutritional value. Disease spread easily in overcrowded barracks. Lice infestations were common. Sanitation facilities were minimal. Medical care existed largely to maintain a labor force, not to heal. For some prisoners, the suffering went even further. At Ravensbrück, a group of Polish women, later known as the Ravensbrück Rabbits, were subjected to medical experiments beginning in 1942. Camp doctors deliberately inflicted wounds or introduced bacteria to test treatments for infections. Others underwent bone and muscle removal procedures. These experiments were conducted without consent and caused lasting disability or death. Documentation of these procedures would later become evidence in post-war war crimes trials. Other camps held female prisoners as well. In occupied Poland, sections of Auschwitz included women's barracks. There, selections determined who would be assigned to labor and who would be sent directly to gas chambers. Although Auschwitz is primarily associated with the genocide of Jews, it also imprisoned resistance fighters and political detainees. Women arrested for underground activity sometimes found themselves in a system built for mass extermination. The distinction between political prisoner and racial target could blur under Nazi categorization. A woman could be both a resistance member and part of a persecuted ethnic group. In such cases, survival odds diminished dramatically. Psychological pressure inside the camps was relentless. Guards enforced discipline through beatings and public punishment. Roll calls, known as appel, required prisoners to stand outside for hours in freezing temperatures or scorching heat while counts were repeated. If numbers did not match records, the entire block could be forced to remain standing until the discrepancy was resolved. Yet even in these conditions, organization quietly formed. Prisoners developed informal hierarchies based on language skills, professional backgrounds, or previous leadership experience. Teachers organized secret lessons. Doctors among the prisoners shared medical knowledge to treat infections with improvised methods. Religious services were conducted in whispers. Songs were memorized and passed along without paper. French resistance members often supported one another through coded communication. Soviet prisoners sometimes formed tight-knit groups, drawing strength from shared military experience. Polish inmates, many of whom had been active in underground networks, created systems to share food and protect the weakest from punishment when possible. These acts were small, but they were acts of resistance. Some women found ways to sabotage production lines subtly. A machine part assembled incorrectly, but not obviously so. A minor defect introduced into a batch of equipment. These risks were enormous. Discovery could lead to execution, but the desire to continue resisting did not disappear behind barbed wire. As Allied forces advanced in 1944 and early 1945, conditions in camps deteriorated further. Supplies dwindled, overcrowding intensified as prisoners were evacuated from camps closer to front lines and transferred deeper into Germany. Typhus outbreaks spread rapidly. Mortality rates sharply increased in the final months of the war. When Soviet troops liberated Ravensbrück in April 1945, they found thousands of prisoners still alive but severely weakened. Many weighed less than 40 kilograms. Medical teams documented extreme malnutrition, untreated wounds, and advanced disease. Similar scenes unfolded as other camps were liberated by Allied forces. In the aftermath, survivors faced a different struggle, telling their stories in a world trying to comprehend the scale of what had happened. During the subsequent trials of camp officials, testimonies described not only physical brutality, but systematic denial of prisoner-of-war protections. Women who believed their uniforms would guarantee legal status had been processed instead through a concentration camp apparatus. The brutality inside these camps was not random chaos, it was structured, bureaucratic, organized through paperwork and quotas. Guards filed reports, doctors recorded procedures, administrators tracked labor output. The system combined ideology with administration, transforming prejudice into policy. And yet, survival itself became an act of defiance. Women who endured Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and other camps carried memories that would reshape historical understanding of the war. Their accounts revealed that the battlefield extended far beyond trenches and front lines. It included prison cells, factory floors, infirmaries turned into experiment rooms, and barracks where solidarity became the only protection available. Inside the camps, brutality took many forms: hunger, labor, humiliation, experimentation. But alongside it existed endurance, a shared piece of bread, a memorized poem, a whispered promise that someone would survive to testify. By the time the gates were opened in 1945, the world would begin to see what had been hidden behind barbed wire. The suffering was immense, the loss incalculable, but so too was the evidence of resilience, proof that even within one of history's most systematic systems of oppression, the human spirit could resist being completely erased.
By the time the war entered its final phase, many of the women imprisoned inside camps and prisons had already endured years of captivity. Liberation was not yet visible on the horizon, but rumors traveled faster than official announcements. Guards whispered about Allied landings. Prisoners overheard fragments of conversation about advancing Soviet forces. In barracks and factory yards, hope and fear began to exist side by side. Despite exhaustion, resistance inside the camps did not disappear. It adapted. In places like Ravensbrück, informal underground networks grew more organized as the war turned against Germany. Women who had once served as couriers, radio operators, or organizers in the resistance applied those same skills behind barbed wire. They memorized guard routines. They mapped storage areas in their minds. They identified prisoners who could be trusted. Information became the most valuable resource. New arrivals often brought news from the outside world: the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the liberation of Paris, the Soviet advance through Eastern Europe. These fragments were repeated quietly from bunk to bunk. Knowledge of approaching armies strengthened morale. It reminded prisoners that the regime holding them was no longer unstoppable. In some labor details connected to military production, women took enormous risks to slow output: a wire not fully tightened, a measurement slightly altered, a small but critical defect introduced into a component destined for the front. These acts rarely destroyed entire shipments, but even minor disruptions could create delays. The danger was constant. Discovery could mean execution or transfer to punishment blocks where survival chances dropped sharply. Courage inside the camps was not always dramatic. Often it was quiet and strategic. Prisoners shared food with the weakest, even when their own rations were barely enough to survive. Doctors and nurses among them improvised treatments using scraps of cloth and diluted disinfectant. Teachers held silent classes, preserving language and history so that cultural identity would not vanish along with physical strength. Spiritual resistance also mattered. In whispered prayers, in songs remembered from childhood, in national anthems hummed so softly that guards could not hear, prisoners maintained connection to something larger than the camp system. Identity became a form of rebellion. To remember one's name, one's country, one's purpose, that itself was defiance. Outside the camps, female prisoners held in traditional prisons or labor sites sometimes encountered similar moments of resistance. Some managed to smuggle notes to civilians. Others protected fellow detainees by claiming responsibility for minor infractions. A few, in rare cases during chaotic transfers, escaped during bombings or transport confusion. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany in early 1945, the Nazi leadership ordered evacuations of camps closer to the front lines. These forced evacuations became known as death marches. Thousands of prisoners were driven on foot across freezing roads with minimal food. Anyone who collapsed risked being shot or left behind.
Even during these marches, solidarity persisted. Survivors later described how women physically supported each other, linking arms to prevent falls. Some took turns carrying those too weak to walk alone. In extreme cases, prisoners formed protective circles around the sick when guards were distracted, shielding them from immediate violence. When liberation finally came, by Soviet troops in the East and American or British forces in the West, it often arrived suddenly. Guards fled, gates were abandoned, soldiers entered camps unsure of what they would find. What they encountered were thousands of emaciated survivors, many barely able to stand. Medical teams documented severe malnutrition, untreated wounds, and disease outbreaks. Photographs and film taken during liberation became some of the most powerful evidence of what had occurred inside the camp system. Among the liberated were women who had once served in resistance networks, in military auxiliary roles, or in partisan units. For many, survival did not bring immediate relief. Years of trauma could not be erased by a single day of freedom. Some were too weak to recover physically. Others faced the shock of returning home to find families displaced or killed. But survival carried another responsibility: testimony. In the months and years following the war, investigations began into crimes committed within the camp system. During the post-war proceedings, including the Nuremberg trials, documentation and survivor testimony played a crucial role. Although the major Nuremberg trials focused on high-ranking officials, subsequent trials addressed crimes committed in concentration camps, including Ravensbrück. Women who had endured imprisonment stood before courts and described what they had seen: forced labor, medical experiments, starvation, executions. Their words transformed private suffering into historical record. The bureaucratic language of camp reports was confronted by human voices. These testimonies carried particular weight because they exposed not only physical brutality, but systematic denial of legal protections. Many of these women had entered service believing international conventions would shield them if captured. Instead, ideology overrode law. The courage required to testify was different from the courage required to survive captivity, but it was no less significant. Reliving trauma in a courtroom demanded strength. Facing former guards demanded composure. Yet without these testimonies, much of the camp system's operation might have remained hidden behind destroyed documents and retreating officials. As Allied Europe began rebuilding, the stories of these women slowly entered public memory. In some countries, recognition came quickly. In others, it took decades for female resistance fighters and captured soldiers to receive full acknowledgement of their roles. Chapter 4 of this history is not defined solely by suffering. It is defined by endurance that extended beyond survival. Resistance did not end at capture. It adapted within prison walls, persisted through forced labor, and continued into courtrooms after the war. The final months of World War II revealed something critical. Even in systems designed to erase individuality, human beings could organize, protect one another, and preserve truth. The barbed wire did not silence every voice. The watchtowers did not extinguish every act of defiance. When the gates opened in 1945, liberation marked the end of imprisonment, but it also marked the beginning of remembrance. And because these women survived, spoke, and testified, the world could no longer deny what had happened behind the wire.
When the war in Europe officially ended in May 1945, celebrations erupted in London, Paris, Moscow, and New York. Crowds filled the streets, church bells rang, flags were raised from buildings that had survived years of bombardment. For many, it felt like the closing of the darkest chapter in modern history. But for countless women who had been captured, imprisoned, and liberated from camps, the end of the war was not a clean break from suffering. It was the beginning of a different battle, one fought in hospitals, in courtrooms, and in memory. Liberation did not instantly restore health. Many survivors weighed dangerously little and suffered from advanced malnutrition, tuberculosis, or untreated infections. Doctors working with Allied forces documented cases of extreme weakness and psychological trauma. Recovery often required months of medical care. Some women would never fully regain their physical strength. Returning home presented another shock. Cities had been destroyed. Families were missing. In Eastern Europe especially, political landscapes were shifting rapidly as Soviet influence expanded westward. Some former resistance members were welcomed as heroes. Others, depending on changing regimes, were viewed with suspicion or political distrust. Recognition of what these women had endured did not always come immediately. The dominant public image of World War II centered on large battles, tank divisions, and battlefield strategy. Male combat narratives dominated early histories. The experiences of female prisoners, especially those who had operated in resistance networks or intelligence roles, often remained in private diaries and scattered testimonies. Yet evidence was accumulating. During the post-war trials of Nazi officials, including proceedings connected to the broader process initiated at the Nuremberg trials, documentation from concentration camps was presented as proof of systematic abuse. In subsequent trials, specifically addressing camp personnel, survivors from facilities such as Ravensbrück testified about forced labor, medical experiments, and deliberate starvation. These testimonies carried enormous weight. They transformed individual suffering into documented history. Court transcripts preserved the details, the procedures, the names, the dates. Guards and administrators who had once operated with near total authority now faced cross-examination. The bureaucratic machinery that had hidden cruelty behind paperwork was exposed in public record. Justice, however, was uneven. Some perpetrators received severe sentences, others evaded capture or reintegrated quietly into post-war society. For survivors, this unevenness could be deeply painful. The knowledge that not all responsible parties were held accountable added complexity to the concept of closure. Psychological scars often lasted decades. Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder did not yet exist in 1945. Many women coped in silence. Nightmares, anxiety, and survivor's guilt were rarely discussed openly. In some communities, speaking about imprisonment in concentration camps carried stigma or discomfort. Silence became a protective mechanism. Over time, memoirs began to appear. Former resistance fighters and camp survivors published accounts detailing their experiences. Historians gradually incorporated these voices into broader studies of the war. Museums and memorial sites were established at former camp locations, including Ravensbrück, ensuring that the physical spaces of suffering became places of education. The legacy of these women also influenced military policy. The post-war world saw expanding roles for women in armed forces across multiple countries. Although progress was gradual, the precedent had been set during World War II. Women had proven their capability in intelligence, aviation, logistics, and even direct combat in certain theaters. Their contributions and their suffering challenged assumptions about who could serve and what protections were necessary. International humanitarian law also evolved. The Geneva Conventions were revised in 1949, expanding protections for prisoners of war and civilians. The experiences of World War II, including the mistreatment of irregular fighters and resistance members, influenced discussions about clearer standards and enforcement mechanisms. While no legal framework can eliminate the brutality of war entirely, the documentation of past abuses shaped future reforms. Memory became a form of justice in itself. Commemorations began including the names of female resistance members executed or lost in camps. Memorial plaques appeared in towns where couriers had once cycled through checkpoints carrying hidden messages.
Educational programs highlighted the role of women in underground movements and auxiliary military services. In some cases, honors came decades later. Medals were awarded posthumously. Streaks were renamed. Archival research uncovered forgotten files. Families learned details about relatives who had rarely spoken of their captivity. The most enduring impact, however, lies in testimony. Survivors who chose to speak did more than recount personal pain. They established a historical record that future generations could examine. Their accounts revealed how ideology can override law, how prejudice can dismantle legal protections, and how ordinary individuals can be placed in extraordinary danger when systems of power abandon humanity. The story does not end with victimhood. It ends with agency reclaimed. Women who had once been reduced to numbers in camp registries became authors, educators, advocates, and witnesses. Some dedicated their lives to human rights work. Others simply raised families, carrying quiet resilience into everyday life. Survival itself became a declaration that the system designed to erase them had failed. Today, when historians analyze World War II, the narrative includes not only generals and battle maps, but also resistance networks, intelligence operations, and the lived experiences of women in uniform. Their role is no longer a footnote. It is recognized as integral to understanding the full scope of the conflict. The events of 1943 and the years that followed exposed a harsh reality. The protections of war are only as strong as the willingness to enforce them. When ideology replaces humanity, rules can collapse quickly. But the post-war response, the trials, the revised conventions, the preservation of testimony demonstrates another truth. Documentation matters. Memory matters. Speaking matters. The women who were captured did not choose the systems that imprisoned them, but through survival and testimony, they shaped how history would judge those systems. War burned across continents. Millions suffered. Among them were women who stepped forward to serve, believing they were part of a struggle governed by law and honor. Many discovered that those principles could vanish under extremist rule. Yet in the aftermath, their voices helped rebuild a moral framework that outlived the regime that tried to silence them. Their story closes not with the fall of Berlin, but with the preservation of truth, carried forward so that future generations understand both the depths of cruelty and the strength required to endure it.